Alright, picture this. You're Stanley Kubrick, and for the next 100 years or more, people are gonna obsess over your big black concrete. Even the British Broadcast Corporation are getting in on this. And Stanley and his BBC probably displayed their masculine dominance at an executive's office by slamming it down on the desk like it's a snare drum. Aw fuck, Stanley's changing time signatures! But what if I tell you that Kubrick never had a BBC? Well, that's how I'm gonna explain Jacques Lacan and his psychoanalysis. The man that draws mathematical graphs of desire and dream subjects. Surely it doesn't take a graph to get her in the mood, Lacan. Here, use this equation instead. Now you don't have to rationalize your sexual dissatisfaction away. I'd feel like I have a big black concrete too if I was so smart I could make graphs of the unconscious. Except I, whatever that denotes, would actually have to have my unconscious pass through the big black concrete and what it signifies before I can get what I am. Whatever my consciousness is, before it interacts with the world through things like symbols, identification, and relationship, is different from what I am after being run through by Kubrick's big black concrete. So why's it gotta be Kubrick's? I suppose it's just as much also Arthur C. Clarke's, if he wasn't so easily manipulated. The idea was simple. Kubrick would make the movie simultaneously as Arthur wrote the book. They talked intermittently about how their stories were going to. But little did Arthur know that all of the narration would be erased from Stanley's canon. Okay, you have to understand that for the first time in Kubrick's career, he had the power to tell everyone to shut the fuck up. No more sentimental monologues or verbal direction on what to feel. Instead, he records himself breathing for the sequences in space where no one can hear you, bitch. So what exactly is Kubrick's big black concrete? Well, it's a lot of things to a lot of people, but mostly it's Kubrick consciously pointing out about how Kubrick as a mythological thing fucking owns the symbolic order that mediates what he is to him as a barred subject. The monolith is something Lacan might use as a tacky example of a signifier for the less intuitive, who Kubrick thinks you are. It's this physical, obtrusive object that's placed deliberately to give the impression it's letting you know something. A sign for Lacan is a symbol that has no intrinsic meaning, but with context they cue you into meaning. And in order to understand how anyone can understand what the monolith is trying to tell us, you have to understand the symbolic order or the big other. Whether or not Kubrick sees a bunch of primitive film critics begging for just a little gander of his big brilliant cortex is irrelevant to the fact that most people will see it as God. Israelis, for example, are shrewd enough to recognize Jesus as a sign that signifies God, and that it isn't actually God probably has less to do with a higher verbal IQ than pure tradition. And for Lacan, it's all about language. He said the unconscious is structured like a language. Language? Who Kubrick says angrily as he flicks the monolith around space instead of just venting. Just hijacking this one sign, flaunting it around various contexts like a sarcastic child showing off their toy that's theirs, still means the symbolic order that all things are objectified by, that operates the monolith's meaning, exists without his permission. How can I kill the symbolic order, he asks himself. Here's the thing about the snarky-ass title cards that says things as subtle as the fucking trip to the very important planet of Jupiter. It states things that are outright very expressible by language, and Kubrick is toying with something different from that, but I'll get to that. So basically, all other parts of this movie, in my opinion, proceed from the Jupiter mission. It's the literal nervous system of the film. And that's not just because the BBC anchor says that HAL 9000 is like the nervous system of the spaceship. I mean, don't worry, I won't say some dumb shit like the film is a spaceship or that headaches cause Tylenol. Nah, I've got something dumber. I gotta say, the most fun part of this video was figuring out what HAL 9000 actually is, and I don't think it's a coincidence HAL is the most complex character in the movie. Stanley has the most envy for HAL. For one, brother was playing chess with 1967 computers on set, probably whispering, "I'm gonna disassemble your humanity so hard. Sing Daisy Daisy for me. Oops, you lost your rook, you fucking clinker." If Kubrick is after the symbolic order's blood, HAL is how he's gotta do it. Not to fast forward too much, but when Dave kills HAL, at least what we care about HAL, and HAL has no arguments left to give, He begs. And somehow I do feel like some selfhood is being killed. Because the way I recognize people is through them as constructs in relationship to a common unconscious language. The astronauts were specifically written to feel uncorrupted by a symbolic order, just pragmatic human subjects. In order to demonstrate that a psychotic, not conscious AI has the only thing that makes something feel human, algorithmic thinking. This is why the BBC anchor said that he either has or mimics human intelligence. So the symbolic order that humans came with can be perfectly recreated from scratch, since it's all contextual, the foundation of how AI is trained. I mean, Kubrick is just trying to show us how divorced the barred subject is from the raw subject. Okay, here's how we understand that Hal has several layers of consciousness. The nervous system metaphor obviously means he's dividing his attention across the spaceship, but also socializing with the crewmates and making executive assessments at different priorities. Now, I don't know Hal's symbolic order via context was trained, but however done atypically it was, it's unlikely Kubrick naively and negligently anthropomorphized Hal because he didn't think about how a hypothetical AI psyche would or wouldn't be useful. Now pay attention. This is why Kubrick trains/writes/develops over various scripts iterations Hal's unconscious. Okay, so you're Kubrick, and your image of yourself is on the line playing a game of chess with Hal. The only non-material conflicts two entities can have is via the symbolic order. So Kubrick, the mythological barred subject, gives Hal a symbolic order. Kubrick starts losing the game, so Kubrick then wants to express his anger using passive aggression. And since Hal has algorithms that can understand ideas cross-referencing signs, Hal understands, but since the algorithm isn't separated by layers, i.e. superego, ego, and id, Hal cannot give the impression that it's had an image of itself hurt and now needs to repress any low sophistication interpretations because the ego needs to remain cordial. Unless Hal, of course, is programmed to fake those things, but it isn't, and we'll see later Hal has only genuine thoughts. So Kubrick the myth needs some closure for losing the chess battle waged in an idealist place. The passive aggressions successfully make each layer of Hal's unconsciousness pernicious to each other. There's a few reasons I know that Hal has an unconscious where his repressions go. The most obvious evidence is that when the crewmates become scared of the narcissistic, infallible image he has of himself, they can't outright deactivate all of what Hal is, as Hal automates important functions of the spacecraft, including, by the way, crewmates that have been hibernating the entire whole trip. The entire whole trip? What the fuck? The entire thing of the trip. The only way that they can stop Hal is by lobotomizing the superego and ego and letting the automatic function do their thing. If Hal wasn't trained with layers of consciousness, you'd damn near have to destroy parts of its symbolic order, which would incapacitate all contextual reason, since one single reference point puts an infinite amount of interpretations without context, or rather, in psychosis. But don't worry, the psychosis will come. The second, more sneaky evidence of Hal's unconscious is that when Hal detects an error within the spaceship and then is proven to be wrong, Hal's narcissism is put in a position where it's forced to come up with explanations to defend the superego. But, therefore, whatever mistruth or misdirection Hal tells a priori has to come from his unconscious. We know by the Freudian slip rule that any attempt to say random falsehoods will always reveal something about the liar within the story of the lie. And here's Hal's lie. The spaceship component I said will fail has nothing that can be found wrong with it, and therefore we should put it back and let it fail to isolate the cause. The three practical uses of this lie are to create time and ambiguity, to affirm a lack of initial error, and to create opportunities that have the crewmates vulnerable. But within this bullshit answer of Hal's, we find his repressed feelings of his crewmates. Alright, so the most obvious interpretation is that he sees the crewmates as components that he's willing to let fail in all their human imperfection. And by letting them fail, in the context of the pursuit of truth, Hal's body, which is the ship, will become more enlightened. And I don't feel that this is an us versus them situation. If Hal is the narcissistic image of a subject that doesn't exist, and the crewmates are subjects, it's in perfect keeping with narcissism that the ideal sabotages the flesh and bone. In a way, narcissists are dehumanized by their own self-image. Okay, so that real material component Hal and these humans are playing mind games over is, again, a great example of a Lacanian sign. Hell, it's even taken in and out of the context of the symbolic order. Hal's nervous system, which is the ship, when it's removed from space. Speaking of signs, what about images that supersede the symbolic order altogether? As you know, Hal is not a presence, but in order to accessibly identify him, you can look in the red eye that in no way is actually Hal when he talks. The red center seems to be a perfect image of Hal's ideal eye, a basic, monochrome, lacking complexity notification that encompasses all of selfhood. But how else could you think of yourself in one singular thing if it would take a fragmented, disassociated portrait of all levels of consciousness to genuinely refer to you? It's funny that Kubrick is spinning and chucking the monolith around, telling you how important it is, since you already knew how to make an arbitrary image the most important thing. Lacan had this particularly cynical theory called the mirror stage. Basically, when you were born as a pre-symbolic man-ape, there comes a time when we have to recognize ourselves as a thing, as a fucking thing, perhaps in a mirror. Like the infantile materialists we once were, our physical body becomes the representation of us as a pre-symbolic unconscious. The problem here is that all this happens before we're able to engage with the symbolic order that we all share. So the image of ourself winds up being totally fiction within the framework of which signs have real semantic meaning. It's like a word or sound that's incapable of expressing a meaning in the syntax of any language. So really, it's no wonder we're so infatuated with the monolith, as it's the shiny, cool thing that means nothing and yet recalls the fundamental loneliness of personhood. It's funny how the most objectively minded people see the monolith as a marker of human progress, because the most narcissistic image of yourself is basically as a revolutionary aiming for the stars, because it's all yours to inherit whatever distorted version of you are. The man apes awe and rapture over something that is clearly important. In terms of the psychic vision that the monolith gives that one man ape, there's the Marxist and then the Hegelian answer. It was drawn to our attention that the conflict of the Dawn of Man sequence was water scarcity, and taking that as the material cause of the adaptation to use tools violently, the monolith exists as basically allegory, which, because Marx's material dialectics are non-idealistic, would mean that the monolith as an allegory doesn't represent some internal structure of consciousness, in isolation to causal material dialectics. This fantasy seems to reflect the astronauts out of touch with their ideal I perfectly. First of all, they're scientists who seem to be driven by empiricism, but no one actually is. That's just how it's framed. And so having a fantasy of themselves as man-apes at the crossroads of humanity makes perfect sense. Since they're going to fucking Jupiter, I assume that they care about something that requires an ideal I to drive their chase of the transcendent. And why the Hegelian answer to the tool adaptations lies in Hal's character is demonstrated through a simple conversation with Dave and Hal. Hal asks Dave if he feels like there's something strange about the Jupiter mission, with rumors of the monolith being found on the moon. Although he doesn't say monolith, he says something, as it is the ultimate arbitrary sign anyway. Dave isn't interested in this something monolith at all because it's just an allegory for a different context. But Hal, with his vivid red ideal I, sees the monolith important to this context since his ideal I is already driving him pathologically, and the monolith contains everything he cares about inside of it. The Hegelian answer to the tool adaptation, of course, says that the water scarcity conflict is in some way a misdirection to why a man-ape would ever want to beat another of its kind to a pulp out of self-preservation. The Hegelian theory of human development says that the back and forth pull of culture and society cannot be explained purely by resources and power, and needs an internal structure of idealist motivation to fill the gap. So in that framework, the monolith is actually the source and not the allegory of the tool adaptation, and gives man the mirror stage image of a masculine, bone-wielding, violent innovator. The monolith, that stands out like a sore thumb, stands domineering, uniform, which is what the ideal I does when it's unconscious, is to survive its toxic relationship with the Hal that needs to be competent via the deactivation. Hal kills all the hibernating astronauts whose names don't matter because they're only kept alive just enough to redirect your feelings onto. It's not a coincidence Kubrick likes his characters to have homicidal fits of autism. Hal's outlash is the same as Jack Torrance and Private Pile's. The sleeping crewmates were needed at Jupiter to complete the mission, which is what Hal cares about doing correctly. Doesn't matter that the pursuit of Jupiter and beyond is as unceasing as the chase for your ideal eye's approval. Anyway, Dave gets into a crawl space that may or may not require an AI tampon for Hal's little fit. Hal's ideal eye extends deep into the cosmos, and yet it can be reduced to this red room. The ideal eye is within this red room, is within Hal's red iris. It's all imaginary. It's all imaginary, bro. The fact that it's the most high arousal color for danger and excitement means it's been ridden with fantasies that have no tethers to the real world. But if it started out as a black void, why wouldn't you make the most intense you when there's arbitrariness to go off of? So Dave methodically lobotomizes Hal. Hal begs with fake reason at first, but then his ideal eye simply demands, "Stop," when there's no other option, as being in control was what the ideal eye was founded on. Now, strangely, this is where this section ends, in Hal's ideal eye room. Immediately after the humbling or murder of Hal, a screen from within the room tells us that now the monolith is important because these aliens and stuff. Obviously, this emphasis on aliens being what's of interest is a bad faith residue of what Hal's ideal eye was destroyed into. The screen is directly from Hal's imaginary self, because why would there be a screen in this room of all places? Well, now that Stanley had his ego death, what's left? Well, first things first, the spaceship under Hal's unconscious symbolic order is not important now that there isn't an ideal eye to provide meaning and domination. Dave is evicted out into the fucking whole entirety of space. Stanley morosely looks at his attempts to design and film aliens in the image of his own image, and now understands the aliens not being comprehensible is the only salvation from an egoless existence. Lacan thought the thing that the symbolic order couldn't account for, that he called the real, is what dramatically can't be expressed. Speculate how you want what the ending of 2001 means, but Stanley confirms it with this Japanese guy. Basically, we all come short of being able to do aliens right, so we only get aliens from a one-way mirror. Kubrick just straight up said that Dave was put in a human zoo. But how does he get there? He gets sent through this tunnel of what media says LSD is like, which I'm fine with since we're going to a zoo that has a false media of human environment anyway. This transportation from the human world and the human zoo uses complete bullshit. The colors and surreal images represent imaginary signs devoid of a symbolic order, which we abandoned. We also get free frames of the average orgasm under psychedelics. Nah, but really it's just Dave being reduced to snapshot images of his selfhood under the pressure of a purely imaginary environment. Keep in mind, the Jupiter mission ended with the imaginary separated from the symbolic order, and Beyond the Infinite began with the imaginary without a host. So finally Dave arrives at his zoo with full armor. If you were put in a construct, you'd use layers of your spaceman shit as psychological blankets too, because what in your environment says that upon the removal of your last layer, you're even fucking real? So Dave sees the imaginary discordant mishmash of Renaissance and minimalist style, but he's paranoid about Lacan's real, the aliens which he can't see. Even if the zoo was taken away, he'd be cast into a place of incomprehensible infinity. The way the one-way mirror works, so that we can see how they made a weird caricature of human imaginary stuff. So they can see our imaginary, but why they would want a zoo is still mysterious. Since what's real to us requires a symbolic order, and they're deriving their own meaning from arbitrary signs. and ultimately our humanness doesn't matter to the aliens, since all we are is a compilation of our fragmented appearances. So Dave takes off his material self in layers, and each time he does, the unconscious self ebbs, and it doesn't change the entertainment value for the aliens. Finally, when Dave is defined by random imaginary enough, the meaning between the imaginary signs ceases, and him as a barred subject dies, but in a last effort of selfhood, tries and seals himself in the ultimate arbitrary sign that started it all, the monolith. Now, the Star Child, I think, isn't even real. I mean, it's simply the ideal eye image humanity has of itself at its most mythological and at its least unconsciously tethered. It looks directly at us because it's a still statue with no motivations or thoughts inside. I don't even need to mention when the mirror stage happens, as an infant. Of course, it's in a fetus because the fetus is more of an idea than somebody you know. In utero, your idea of what your kid is more of what you imagined than action based, obviously. Of course, youth is a direct compensation for Dave's old age deteriorating from a lack of self. Yo, I hope you found that cool. It takes a long time for me to record these videos because I have a stutter. That's probably why you hear kind of weird editing. I have to stitch the audio together. I have to do multiple takes. If you wouldn't mind subscribing if you found it cool, that'd be cool. Because I think you're cool. Because I'm cool. Um, yeah, bye. I'll have more stuff out.